As an easy rule of thumb to anybody listening to this, if a politician doesn't support the PRO Act, they are not pro-union, period. And if they're not pro-union, they're not pro-worker.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Speaking of, politicians and thinking of themselves as like pro-working class, Hamilton Nolan recently wrote a piece about the scam of the working class kind of Republican. And he went on Doug Henwood's show to debate Sohrab Ahmari about that proposition. Basically, Hamilton Nolan saying there's not really such a thing as the pro-worker power, Republican Party, and Sohrab Ahmari taking the position that even while there's a small kind of minority, it's still there, it's noticeable, and it's growing. So, I pulled a couple of clips from that debate, but I guess, Adam, by way of like table setting, can you let folks know what Hamilton, like kind of the general thesis of Hamilton's piece?
Well, I'll do my best, understanding that it's been a couple of weeks since I read it. I'll be honest with you on that. But really what I recall from the piece that stood out to me is that to paint yourself as pro-worker, there's really like two big issues that you could point to. Number one, where do you stand on unions? All right. That is our key tool for worker power. And number two, on the subject of power, what are you doing to check the influence of corporate power? Right? So that's kind of the rub. Like, where do you land on the balance of power between labor and capital? Are you trying to help labor or are you trying to help capital? You can help us with our unions and with more taxes and regulations on capital. No one really that is painting themselves as a pro-worker Republican is doing that, right? I mean, they're happy to get union endorsements, but they're not out there, advocating that workers join unions, build strong unions, that the federal government or state government at least stay out of the way of this process, if nothing else. So that's not really happening. And of course, there's, while there's posturing about controlling corporate power, it's almost universally in the context of the culture war, right? They may critique Silicon Valley, for example, or Hollywood, for example, but it's over cultural crap. It's because they don't like gay people being on the movies, stuff of that nature, or they feel like they're being censored on Facebook because, their racist uncle got banned on Facebook, and so now they're upset at Silicon Valley. There's no real plan to actually constrain or just hold in check the growing inequality or growing corporate power. So that's really what I recall from the piece that stood out to me, is like that question of power and where do they stand on that. And typically, anytime you hear Republicans talking about working class or posturing towards workers, it's almost always going to be cultural or immigrant related. And you mentioned that earlier in the show, that's typically the pivot, right? It's bashing immigrants and talking about culture war. And, unfortunately, some of that is effective in this country because class is very mystified. You've got a lot of people out here who think they're middle class when they're not. You've got a lot of people, particularly, because of the media and popular consciousness, like people associate class with cultural identities. And so Republicans will show up wearing flannel shirts and driving a pickup truck and listening to country music and try to portray themselves as working class, even though they're actually a business owner who is a multimillionaire, right? But they can put on this aesthetic that they have built an image around as, constituting working class. Of course, the working class is the most diverse class in this country by far. So, disproportionately black and brown, and so much more diverse than the image that they portray. But yeah, those were some of my, just takeaways from reading that. And I do recommend folks check it out because it's really good. I recommend everything Hamilton puts out is worth it's worth a follow for sure, but definitely check that out.
Yeah, for sure. And so that is what Sohrab did.
Right. And Jacob, we do have a caller on the line. If you want to get the caller before we get into this debate, I don't know if their call is related, but
it looks like they just dropped, actually. I don't know
okay.
what happened.
All right.
So
call us back if you're interested in talking about this for sure. Because it's a hot topic right now with a lot of folks posturing to be pro-worker. Believe it when I see it.
Yeah. So that is basically what Sohrab did when he debated Hamilton Nolan on Doug Henwood's show. And so Hamilton Nolan called him out on it. So let's listen to Hamilton's first response to Sohrab.
But look, we need to talk about what the policies are that constitute the alleged pro-worker agenda of the Republican Party. As an easy rule of thumb to anybody listening to this who is not a labor journalist or doesn't follow this that closely, if a politician doesn't support the PRO Act, they are not pro-union, period. And if they're not pro-union, they're not pro-worker. They are not in favor of increasing worker power because strengthening unions is the key to increasing worker power in this country. I was at the National Conservatism Conference a few weeks ago in D.C. J.D. Vance was there, and the Heritage Foundation was there, and Orrin Cass was there, and they had a whole panel about the right-wing pro-worker agenda. And one guy who was speaking there was Riley Moore, who's the state treasurer of West Virginia, who was talking about his pro-worker credentials as a Republican. Part of his claim to being pro-worker was, I'm against a national right-to-work law. And so I asked him if he was in favor of a right-to-work law in West Virginia, where he lives, and he said yes. Where he had the power to influence something, he was in favor of right-to-work law, which is an anti-labor, anti-union law. And then where he had no power to influence anything, he was not in favor of a national bill. And that's kind of analogous, I think, to what we hear from the right in terms of what their pro-worker agenda is. Like, if you want to talk about policy-wise what constitutes a pro-worker agenda in America, let's talk about the NLRB. The NLRB is the government agency that enforces labor law. Jennifer Abruzzo is the head of the NLRB. She's the most pro-labor, most pro-union official in the entire U.S. government right now. She's done a lot of great things. As soon as Donald Trump is elected president, if he wins the election, he's going to fire Jennifer Abruzzo, and he's going to install an anti-union attorney in that position, and they are going to systematically roll back every pro-worker advance that the NLRB has made over the past 4 years. That means independent contractors who are misclassified and can't organize. That's something we're trying to reform. They're going to roll that back. The joint employer, which you touched on, I'm glad that Josh Hawley is pro-joint employer, but the whole Democratic Party is for that. So it's nice that there's one Republican who's for the joint employer rule, which would, for example, make McDonald's be responsible for how its workers are treated. But that's something that essentially the entire Republican Party wants to roll back. By the way, you can read Project 2025 has an entire section on labor. It's very terrifying, and all of this stuff is spelled out very clearly in there.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Totally agree with everything you said there. I don't see any lies there.
Right. And I think particularly the one from that fellow from West Virginia, not supporting, making a big deal out of not supporting a national right to work bill, but you still support right to work in the state of West Virginia. I mean, that's just, how much more kind of crass can you get, I guess.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that totally tracks. I mean, where some of these folks will take the occasional pro-worker position, it's where they can easily do so without making any real impact. Holler at me when they're actually upsetting donors.
Right.
That's what I want to see.
Right. And so this is Sohrab's response to Hamilton asking again, what is the policy I don't want to hear, it's always immigration or maybe tariffs. Give me something real. What's the policy? Here's Sohrab's response.
Okay, so let me just go back to the immigration, because
almost all you've talked about here, though, is restricting immigration and expelling the ones we've got. So,
well, here's why I bring it up is because, Hamilton's like, well, where is the pro-worker component of this? I agree that Republican National Labor Relations Board are going to be lousier than Democratic ones. That could change over the long term as the realignment between the parties goes on. They're going to have to sort of be responsive to that. But as it is, that's not such an easy issue to dismiss. Again, it's not the only issue. There is NLRB. I support the PRO Act insofar as I have influence over these kind of populist Republicans. I tell them to support the PRO Act. But we have to reckon with the fact that the Democratic agenda today is not entirely attractive. There has been a de-alignment between working class people and the Democratic Party.
I just want to point out that I said up front, when you try to have this conversation with right-wing people, it goes away from unions and directly into immigration, and that's where we are now. If you keep workers desperate and poor and underpaid, of course they're going to fear immigrants because they're in a desperate and tenuous situation. The vision of the labor movement is to elevate the working class out of that situation, so it's not a matter of scaremongering against immigrants.
Sohrab, you're not really doing much to disprove Hamilton's claim that when you talk to pro-worker Republicans, you're going to hear it mostly about immigration, because that's mostly what you've been talking about.
Well, no, I've also been talking about free trade. It wasn't Democrats who launched the uprising against the free trade regime that has resulted in us now imposing tariffs against China, now trying to do industrial policy and so on. That was led by the Trumpian uprising, and it was led by Trump. And now I'm glad now it's become a bipartisan consensus. And the U.S. Trade Representative under Biden, Catherine Tai, says, I have very little daylight between me and my predecessor, the Republican Robert Lighthizer. So that's a huge issue. And it's one of the reasons why you have those Obama to Trump voters from 2016. Why did they, having supported Obama twice, why did people in these post-industrial places support Trump? Was it just because of bigotry? Was it just because they're deplorables? No, because they were angry over a Democratic Party that had pushed through NAFTA, and then fast forward 20 years, and they were trying to push the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which would have been another trade deal along the NAFTA lines. You guys say that's just isolationism? That's culture war? No, it's not. It's a kind of much more a reversion to a New Deal mentality about trying to think about trade. That's enduring now, and I'm glad. I think even if we have a Harris-Walz administration, that consensus is going to be in place. But that consensus was brought about by a right populist uprising. The Democrats weren't going to go there. Their representative at that time was Hillary Clinton, who was a total neoliberal globalization type.
Speaking of tariffs, I actually was just looking at the numbers myself for a piece I'm writing for Jacobin, and Trump increased tariffs on aluminum and steel. Aluminum and steel production in the U.S. fell afterwards, and so did aluminum and steel employment. The policy was not a success on its own terms, so I'm not sure that intensifying our dedication to tariffs is going to turn around the state of the working class. These jobs are disappearing mainly because of automation and not just the evil Chinese.
So there you go. I mean, really, pretty thorough detangling of Sohrab's arguments, which is, I don't know. It's difficult. It really is difficult to kind of see figure out what his deal is, because he does hearing him, he seems like he's committed to this kind of economic populist type stuff, but it seems like he is committed to seeing that come about through the Republican Party as opposed to the Democratic Party, because he has all these socially conservative values. And it's just weird. It's frankly, and this is, I hope this does not happen, but I think that you would have an easier time getting Democrats as a party to go back on social issues than you would getting Republicans to move forward on labor issues, right? Because one is material to the bosses and one is more or less not. The bosses are not going to go to bat for LGBT equality. So I do think that just as a project, that would be easier. But then also, it really is difficult for me to kind of get in the mind of somebody who recognizes that, like, yes, the left-wing economic policies are good. I still have these socially conservative values. And so I recognize with the way that the parties are set up right now, I'm going to have to sacrifice one. And so I'm going to sacrifice the economics. I'm going to sacrifice the material. It's just so bizarre to me.
Well, yeah, but I don't think there's, I don't know. I don't want to read too much into his individual situation, but yeah, it is kind of weird. I mean, I think there are plenty of people out there who have some similar beliefs, and that they're probably, maybe more culturally conservative than some, but would lean more progressive on a lot of economic policies. I do think that, there was elements of some truth in what he was saying in terms of disgruntlement with the Democratic Party. That's absolutely true. As I said earlier, Democratic Party has, you can debate on whether or not it ever was truly a working class party and like how you define that. But certainly in the last 40, 50 years, they have more or less embraced, the neoliberal consensus of privatization and globalization and free trade and austerity. That seems to have changed maybe a little bit in the last couple of years under the Biden administration. There's been some shift away from that, more reform, more federal investment. But, that's a whole little pretty late compared to decades of this situation going on. So, yeah, I think there's some truth that, there's certainly good reasons for disillusionment with the Democratic Party among working class people. But what he doesn't want to just come right out and say is that powerful, wealthy interests on the right see that as just an opportunity to peel off some white working class voters through appeals to bigotry, primarily. So that's what I think. As critical as I am of both parties, because I think neither one is a working class party. Both are very capitalist parties, dominated by capitalist interests. And on foreign policy, there's not nearly enough difference between them. But there are real differences, I think, between the parties in terms of policies. And the NLRB that Hamilton brought up, that's a really good example. I mean, that will make people's lives worse, right? If Trump wins and, demolishes the NLRB, that is going to make life harder for union workers and for workers who want a union. That's a real thing. Doesn't mean I give Harris or Biden a pass or I'm any less critical of them. It's just, being nuanced enough, I guess, to appreciate the differences and discern. And I think you can be critical of something while also recognizing it's maybe not as bad as something else. I think that's perfectly reasonable, right? You can criticize both parties while also acknowledging some differences on certain areas. I also wanted to lift up a comment. Someone in the chat mentioned Bernie Sanders, and I think that if you're going to talk about this shifting consensus around trade, or maybe there does seem to be more consensus around not so orthodox free trade policy. The Democrats did seem to abandon TPP, but yeah, I think the conservative Sohrab, I think his name, he totally misses the whole Bernie phenomena that happened, because I remember Bernie talking about those issues. I remember him talking frequently on the campaign trail about many communities being left behind in the wake of NAFTA and globalization. So, I think there absolutely was a left populist discussion of those issues as much or more than on the right. And as pointed to by Doug on the show, on the clip that you played, we have to look at the results. I'm sensitive to the fact that we have had a lot of outsourcing and globalization. And so, when Trump talks about that, there is a real issue that's being talked about. That's true. But what are the policies actually producing? Are they making things better? From the evidence I've seen, I'm just not convinced that anything Trump did actually made things better for working people. There's a pretty overwhelming amount of evidence he made things better for rich people, but that's just the facts of it. Sorry.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.